The summer morning began in a way that felt ordinary enough to be forgettable, with clear light settling over the lower slopes of the mountain and a steady stream of hikers arriving at the trailhead, each carrying small pieces of expectation that looked the same from a distance, but meant different things to the people who held them. And among them was a 12-year-old boy named Jared Negrete, who stood a little apart from the others while his scout troop gathered, adjusting straps and checking lists. The kind of quiet preparation that makes an outing feel organized and safe before anyone has taken a single step. And he had been given only a few simple things to bring: a small camera, some snacks, a full canteen, and the uniform that made him feel like he belonged to something larger than himself. And he wore sneakers instead of boots, which did not seem important at the time because the trail was well known and marked and already busy with other people. And the mountain itself, Mount San Gorgonio, did not look threatening from this distance, rising in long, calm slopes that suggested effort but not danger. And there was a sense, shared by parents, leaders, and even the boys themselves, that this was not an expedition into the unknown, but a managed challenge, something designed to teach patience and endurance rather than test survival. And Jared, who had grown up in the city and knew the outdoors, mostly through organized trips and camps, looked at the trail with the same mixture of curiosity and mild nervousness as the others. And yet nothing about him that morning suggested that this would be a day remembered for anything other than tired legs and stories told on the drive home. And the group began to move, first slowly and then with a steady rhythm, passing signs and other hikers, hearing the ordinary sounds of wind in the trees and boots on dirt. And as the hours went by, the air grew thinner and cooler, the path climbing in long switchbacks that made progress feel both constant and strangely slow. And Jared did his best to keep up, stopping when the others stopped, drinking when they drank, taking pictures of the wide views and the narrow stretches of trail. And at first, no one noticed anything wrong, because nothing was wrong in a way that could be clearly named. And only later would people look back at this part of the day and try to find the exact moment when something small began to change, when the space between one boy and the rest of the group became just a little longer than it should have been, when the trail that seemed so clear began, without warning, to feel like a place where being alone might be possible, even with dozens of people nearby. And when the mountain, which had looked so open and understandable in the morning light, started to reveal how easily it could hide what did not stay exactly where it was expected to remain. Asterisk as the group continued higher. The easy confidence of the early morning slowly gave way to the quiet strain that comes from thin air and long climbs. And the trail that had felt welcoming began to show its real character. Not in any dramatic way, but in the steady way it asked for more attention with every step. And Jared, who had started the day with enough energy to joke and point his camera at distant ridges, began to fall into a quieter rhythm, focusing more on his breathing than on the view. And at first, this went unnoticed because everyone was tired in their own way. And the path itself encouraged the group to stretch out, with faster walkers naturally moving ahead and slower ones taking their time through the long switchbacks. And there was nothing unusual about this, nothing that would have made anyone stop and count heads every few minutes. And yet the distance between Jared and the others began to grow in small, almost polite amounts, a few steps here, a longer pause there, and each time he told himself he would catch up at the next bend or the next shaded patch of trail. And sometimes he did, arriving just as the group was starting again. And sometimes he did not, and by the afternoon the mountain had taken on a different mood, not hostile, but quieter, as if the sounds of voices and movement were being slowly absorbed into the wide spaces between trees and rocks. And hikers passed in both directions, offering brief nods or short comments about the weather and the climb. And it was during one of these moments that a small group noticed Jared walking alone, not far off the marked path, and they told him to stay on the trail because the slopes were steeper and less forgiving than they looked. And he listened and nodded, and for a while it seemed as if he followed their advice. But the pattern of the trail made shortcuts tempting, with long curves that looked as though they could be crossed more quickly by cutting across. And several people later remembered seeing a boy who matched his description moving between these winding paths, sometimes appearing above them, sometimes below, always in a hurry that did not quite match the steady pace of the mountain. And somewhere in this slow, stretched-out afternoon, the simple fact of distance became more serious, because the group ahead no longer heard his footsteps or his breathing behind them. And no one could say exactly when that happened, only that at some point the trail felt too quiet, and when they looked back, the space where he should have been was empty, and the mountain, which had seemed so carefully organized by signs and paths, now felt larger and less certain, not because anything dramatic had occurred, but because one small, ordinary presence was no longer where it had been expected to remain. And in a place where everything depends on staying within sight and sound of others. That absence was the first real sign that the day was no longer following the simple plan. Everyone thought they were on ** by the time the search officially began. The mountain had already settled into the kind of quiet that makes distance hard to judge, where sounds do not travel the way they should, and every slope seems to hide another slope behind it. And the first people to go back up the trail were not yet thinking in terms of days or weeks, but in terms of minutes and hours, because the most natural assumption was that Jared had simply gone the wrong way and would be found sitting somewhere, tired or embarrassed or waiting for someone to notice he was gone. And at first the effort felt almost casual, a few people walking briskly, calling his name, checking behind rocks and around bends in the path. And when that produced nothing, the tone changed without anyone having to say so. And by the next morning, organized teams began to arrive. Men and women who are used to moving through difficult ground with maps and radios and a calm that comes from repetition. And they treated the mountain like a large, complicated puzzle, dividing it into sections and working through each one carefully, not rushing, not guessing, but following patterns and procedures that had worked in other places. And from above, helicopters traced slow, deliberate paths across the ridges, their noise briefly filling the valleys before fading again. And from the ground, searchers moved in lines, scanning the earth for anything that did not belong there, a footprint, a scrap of fabric, a mark on a stone that suggested someone had passed in a hurry. And yet the terrain resisted this kind of order. Because Mount San Gorgonio is not a smooth or open space, but a collection of sharp angles and hidden drops and patches of vegetation that can swallow small objects without leaving any obvious sign. And many of the areas that needed to be checked were places where a single mistake could send a person sliding far enough that they would not be seen from above or below. And still the teams went, carefully, methodically. And as the hours turned into a full day of searching, a strange pattern began to form. Not of what they were finding, but of what they were not. Because there were no clear trails leading away from the main path, no broken branches, no disturbed soil that pointed in one direction more than another. And it was as if the boy had simply stepped out of the shared space of the trail and into something that did not leave tracks. And this absence of evidence was more unsettling than any single clear sign would have been, because it left every possibility open and none of them easy to follow. And by the end of that first day, when the light began to fade and the search had to pause, there was a growing sense that the mountain was not giving anything back, not even small answers, and that whatever had happened had already been folded into the size and silence of the place, waiting without any clear intention of being found. On the second day, the search returned to the same slopes with a different kind of patience. the sort that comes from realizing that nothing is going to resolve itself quickly. And the mountain, unchanged and calm in the morning light, seemed almost indifferent to the lines of people moving across it, and it was during these slower, more careful passes that the first small troubling detail appeared, not in a dramatic place, and not in a way that could be seen from far away, but off to the side of the trail, near a stretch of rocky ground that most hikers avoided without thinking about it, where someone noticed a single footprint pressed into the dirt. And at first, it did not seem important because the mountain was full of prints, layered over each other from days and weeks of traffic. But this one was different in a way that made people stop and look twice, because it matched the kind of shoe Jared had been wearing, and because of where it was, far enough from the marked path that stepping there would have required a choice, or at least a moment of inattention. And the slope below it dropped away into a mess of rocks and brush that could not be searched from a distance. And the teams focused on that area, moving slowly, checking every place where a body or a pack might have come to rest, and yet, again, they found nothing. And this single print, instead of leading them forward, became a kind of boundary, a point beyond which the trail of certainty did not continue. And as the day went on, more people were brought in, including some who had been on the mountain the day Jared disappeared, and they tried to retrace what they had seen, where they had been. And one firefighter pointed out the general area where he remembered speaking to a boy walking alone. And when searchers worked outward from that spot, they were met with the same problem as before, a landscape that offered too many places for something to be hidden, and not enough signs to suggest where to begin. And the mountain itself seemed to absorb sound and movement, so that even when many people were working close together, it still felt as though each small group was alone in a much larger space. And by the afternoon, the sense of progress was measured not in discoveries, but in how much ground had been ruled out. And that kind of progress is difficult to feel, because it does not bring you closer to a person, only to the edges of what you do not know. And when evening came again, there was a quiet frustration in the way people packed up and prepared to leave the slopes, not anger and not despair, but the heavy understanding that they were dealing with something that did not fit neatly into the usual patterns. Because a lost hiker normally leaves a trail of small mistakes behind them, a turned ankle, a dropped item, a clear change in direction. And here there was only one fragile mark in the dirt, sitting where it should not have been, and beyond it, nothing that could be followed with confidence. And the mountain, still and unchanged, kept whatever else it knew to itself, not asterisk several days into the search. When the routines had become familiar, and the mountain had begun to feel less like a place to explore and more like a long series of questions, the first truly personal object was found. And it did not appear in a dramatic location or at the end of some clear trail, but at the bottom of a slope that looked like many others, steep enough to be dangerous, but not so extreme that it demanded special attention. And someone noticed a shape that did not belong among the rocks and brush. And when they reached it, they saw that it was a backpack, worn and dusty, resting in a way that suggested it had been set down rather than thrown or torn away. And inside were small, ordinary things, wrappers from snacks, a few remaining supplies, and the camera Jared had brought with him. And this discovery changed the mood of the entire effort in a quiet but immediate way, because for the first time there was something that could be touched and examined, something that had clearly been with him after he left the main trail. And yet even this did not answer the most basic question of where he had gone next. And the area around the pack was searched again and again, carefully and then more carefully still. But there were no signs of a struggle, no clear path leading away, and no indication that he had fallen or been carried. And when the camera's film was developed, the images told a story that was both simple and unsettling. with the first photographs showing ordinary views of the mountain taken earlier in the hike, and the final one taken at night. A close and awkward frame of his own face, lit by the camera's flash, as if he had been using it to see or to check something in the dark. And this single picture, instead of explaining anything, only added another layer of uncertainty, because it suggested that he had been moving after sunset, long after he should have been back with the others. And yet it did not show where he was or what he was trying to do. And the pack itself raised even more questions, because leaving behind food and water and the one tool he had for recording his surroundings made little sense, unless he believed he would be returning to it. And that belief, whatever had created it, did not match what happened afterward. And as the days went on and more people joined the effort, the search area grew larger, and the hope of finding something clear grew smaller, and officials began to quietly rule out certain possibilities, not because they had answers, but because there were no signs to support them. And still the mountain remained full of places where a person could disappear without leaving a trace. And each evening ended the same way, with tired teens coming down the trails, in the sense that the most important moment of the story, the moment when Jared decided where to go next, was still hidden somewhere above them, unmarked and silent, and perhaps already beyond any reasonable way of being found. Asterisk, when the search was finally called off, it did not feel like a decision so much as an admission, a quiet recognition that the mountain had stopped giving anything back, and the trails returned to their usual rhythm of hikers who did not know where to look for what had been missed. And for a time, Jared's name remained present in reports and conversations, spoken carefully, as if repeating it might still attach it to something solid. But seasons have a way of moving forward, even when stories do not. And the slopes where hundreds of people had once walked in careful lines slowly lost the marks of that effort, and the absence became harder to point to in any physical way. And years later, when another young hiker vanished in a similar place, and then, unlike Jared, eventually returned, confused and unable to clearly explain where he had been, people were reminded that the mountain does not always take and keep. And that made the earlier disappearance feel even stranger, because it suggested that there were moments when someone could be lost and then found again, and other moments when the same landscape offered no such return. And those who had been involved in the original search would sometimes think back to the single footprint, the backpack resting where it should not have been, and the photograph taken in the dark, and none of these things formed a complete path, but together they pointed to a stretch of time that no one else had seen, and that could not be reconstructed from maps or procedures. And in official terms, the case remained simple. A young hiker presumed to have suffered an accident in difficult terrain. But simple explanations do not always feel complete, especially when they leave so much space unfilled, and visitors to the mountain still walk the same trails, pass the same signs, and stand in the same wide, quiet places without noticing anything unusual. And perhaps that is what makes the story linger, not because there is something visibly wrong with the place, but because there is nothing to mark the exact point where an ordinary day quietly failed to continue as expected. And somewhere between the last moment he was seen and the first moment people realized he was truly gone, there is a gap that has never closed. And the mountain, unchanged and patient, continues to hold that space without comment, offering views and silence in equal measure, and leaving behind only the uneasy understanding that sometimes a person does not vanish in a way that can be clearly traced, but simply steps into a part of the world that does not give them back. And all that remains is a trail that still leads up, still leads down, and never quite leads to the place where the story ended.